Today we're going to talk about adding a vertical shift to our graphs of our trig functions. So let's just do a little recap on the parent functions of our trig functions, or the general functions of our trig functions. Y equals a sine b of x minus h plus k, or y equals a cosine b of x minus h plus k. Remember, A was our amplitude, which was our vertical stretch. B was our horizontal stretch. A normal period of sine and cosine was 2 pi. So to get B, you take 2 pi divided by the period. Or vice versa, to get the period, you take 2 pi divided by b. We talked about yesterday that h meant our horizontal shift, which meant left or right. K is our vertical shift, which means up or down. We are going to add in a vertical shift on our graphs today. In the trig functions, when you shift vertically, you will always shift off of the midline. And in our parent function, our midline was at y equals 0. Graphs of sines and cosines are called sinusoids. So it might ask you a question, write the equation of the sinusoid or graph the sinusoid. All that means is you're going to graph a sine or a cosine function. So let's recall these parent functions. The sine parent function is y equals sine x. And sine began at 0, 0. Then we went up, back to 0, down, back to 2 pi. And we had one cycle of sine. Cosine's parent function, y equals cosine of x. Cosine began up at 0, 1. Then back to 0, down, back to 0, up. And we have one graph of cosine. A was the amplitude. So to find the amplitude, you look how far it raised above or below. So if I take the difference of my max minus my min and divide it by 2, I will get my amplitude. For example, this max was positive 1, this min was negative 1. So if I take 1 minus a negative 1 and divide it in half, I get 2 divided by 2, and it gives me 1 for my amplitude. And that was my amplitude of this function. To get your vertical shift, you are going to count from your midline. We have not talked about how to calculate a midline. A midline is calculated by taking the average of your max and your min. That simply means my midline was y equals, I'm going to average my max and min. Well, my max was 1. Average means to add your min, negative 1, and divide by 2. That gives me 0 divided by 2. That gives me a midline of 0. Y equals 0, and that was my midline. All right, let's start graphing. We have y equals 5 plus 2 sine of 1/2 x. Our amplitude is always located in front of our trig function. So first let's find our trig function. It is sine. So the number in front of sine is 2. That is my amplitude. So 2 is my amplitude. The number right behind sine is our b. So our period for sine is 2 pi. Well, I must factor out that b, so divided by a half. 2 pi divided by a half means 2 pi times the reciprocal of a half is 2, gives me 4 pi for my period. So this other number must be the vertical shift. So my vertical shift is up 5. So just like before, I'm going to start with plotting my period, 4 pi. So this is 0. I have to find each tick mark, and that would be 4 pi and divide it into fourths. So if this is 4 pi, I'm going to divide that into fourths. 1, 2, 3, 4. Each tick mark then is worth pi. So this is 1 pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi. My amplitude is 2, so 1, 2, and 1, -2. There I have my x and my y axis labeled. Now, I would just normally start plotting my points, but I have this vertical shift of 5. So I am going to have to first shift my axes up to 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that is where my new midline is going to be. So when I do my amplitude, I'm going to have to do it from my midline. So 2 above would bring me here to 7, and 2 below would bring me to 3. So now I'm ready to plot my points. Sine begins at 0, 0. Well, here is my new origin. So when I plot my points, 0, 0 at the new origin, and then I go up, back to 0, down, back to 0. I'm going to go through those. So that means my domain is all reals because it'll cyclically continue on. My range went from 3 to 7. 3 is less than or equal to y, which is less than or equal to 7. Okay, let's try another graph. Y equals -4 minus cosine x. I just want you to know that these graphs could be written as y equals negative cosine x minus 4. So they could have the trig function first and then that number last. So this can actually be moved back here sometimes as well. All right, so let's start. Our amplitude is what is in front of your trig function. Well, here is my trig function. In front of it is a -1. Remember, amplitude must always be positive. So amplitude is just this number, 1. That negative indicates that we are going to have to reflect our graph. Just like when we took a parabola times a -a, it actually flipped it down. Well, this is going to flip our trig function as well. So we're going to reflect it. That's what this negative means. My period for cosine is 2 pi. My b is also 1, so 2 pi divided by 1 gives me 2 pi. My vertical shift then is this -4, which means down 4. So first, I'm going to plot my period scale to 2 pi. So every tick will be 2 pi divided into fourths. 1, 2, 3, 4. That gives me pi over 2. So 1 pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, which reduces to pi, 3 pi over 2, 4 pi over 2. There's my x-axis. Then I do this vertical shift. So I have to take my 0 and go down 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So there is my new midline. Now my amplitude is 1. So 1 above 4 is at -3. 1 below -4 is at -5. So now I have my x and y axes labeled appropriately. I can start plotting my cosine function. Well, cosine started up at 1. Here is my new axes. But I need to reflect that up 1. So reflect of up 1 is down 1. So I'm going to plot down 1. Then I come up to my midline, up 1, back to my midline, down 1. And I'm going to cyclical curve through those. Since it's cyclical on my x is all reals. My range went from -3 to -5. Oops, the other way around. -5 to -3. -5 is lower. Okay, let's try another one. 2 minus the sine of 2 pi x. First, find my trig function. It is sine. My amplitude is the positive number in front of sine, so it is a 1. This negative means I'm going to have to reflect. My period for sine is normally 2 pi, but my b is 2 pi, so I have to divide out 2 pi. That gives me a period of 1. My vertical shift then is this number, +2, which means I'm going to go up 2. So first I'm going to plot my period. So if this is 1 and this is 0, every tick mark will take place by dividing this 1 into fourths. So this is 1/4, 2/4, which is a half, 3/4, 4/4, which is 1. There's my x-axis. Now I do this vertical shift of up 2. 1, 2. And there's my midline. Now I do my amplitude. Up 1 from 2 is at 3. Down 1 would be at 1. And all of my x and y axes are labeled. Now I'm ready to start plotting my points. But I'm going to have to remember to reflect. So, sine starts at 0, 0. Well, 0 reflected is still at 0. So there's my shifted axes. Then I go up 1, so the reflective up is down. Then back to midline, up, and back to midline. And there is my sine function. The domain, x is all reals. The range, let's see, y went from 1 to 3. Did I reflect this one? I did not reflect it. Oh, I did. All right. Last one to graph. Y equals -3 plus cosine of 3/4 x. First find your trig function, cosine. The number in front of cosine is 1, so my amplitude is 1. My period for cosine is 2 pi. I must divide out my b, which is 3/4. So 2 pi divided by 3/4 is the same as multiplying by 4/3. That gives me 8 pi over 3. So then my vertical shift is this number, -3. So I must go down 3. So here's my 0. 8 pi over 3. Let's say it's right here. So every tick mark will be 8 pi over 3, and I'm going to divide that into fourths. So I'm dividing that into fourths. So when I reduce, that's a 2 and a 1. Every tick mark will be 2 pi over 3 units. So now instead of counting by 1 pi over 3, 2 pi over 3, 3 pi over 3, we're counting by 2's. So this is 2 pi over 3, 4 pi over 3, 6 pi over 3, which reduces to 2 pi, 8 pi over 3. My vertical shift is at -3, so I have to go down 3. And there's my midline. My amplitude is 1. So 1 above -3 is -2. 1 below -3 is -4. And there I have everything labeled, and I'm ready to go. Sine normally begins at 1, 0. So here was my shift. 1, 0, back to 0, down, back to midline, up. I'm going to curve through those. Since it's cyclical, X is all reals. This time my range went from -4 to -2.